Hello guys, Bingocat here. So today's video is just going to be sort of an old school operating systems comparison video. I haven't done one of these in quite a while, but I realized the other day that I have never done an operating system comparison video where I've compared anything to a Linux operating system. So today I have Windows 10 and Linux Mint running together side by side. For those of you who don't know, Linux Mint is basically Linux for noobs, to say the least. Linux Mint is touted for being easy to use, easier than pretty much every other Linux-based operating system. Ubuntu is also a pretty easy one. That used to be the sort of go-to for a long time, being one of the easiest Linux distributions to use. But nowadays, it's pretty much Linux Mint because it looks sort of pretty similar to Windows. It doesn't look exactly identical, obviously, but it looks pretty similar to Windows. So the system requirements for Windows 10 is 1 gigahertz or faster processor, 1 gigabytes of RAM for the 32-bit version, or 2 gigabytes of RAM for the 64-bit version, and I'm running the 64-bit version of Windows 10 in VMware. Hard disk space is 16 gigabytes for 32-bit OS, or 20 gigabytes for a 64-bit OS. A DirectX 9 or later with WDDM 1.0 driver, which is pretty much every graphics card sold nowadays, and a display of at least 800 by 600 resolution. Linux Mint the operating system requirements are a little tiny bit lighter. It has a system requirements of 512 megabytes of RAM, but it has 1 gigabyte of RAM recommended, 9 gigabytes of disk space, but 20 gigabytes recommended, and a resolution that's actually higher than Windows of 1024 by 768 resolution. First of all, I think the recommended system requirements for both operating systems, well, excuse me, not recommended, minimum system requirements, they're too low, okay? I personally believe that if you're going to run this on an actual physical computer, for Windows, you nowadays need an absolute minimum. I don't care if you're running Windows 7, Windows 8.1, or Windows 10. You need a minimum of 8 gigabytes of RAM. If you're getting a new computer, heck, even if you're getting a refurbished computer, 8 gigabytes really should be the minimum. I don't care if the computer is for your 85-year-old grandma who only checks the news on her computer. Get 8 gigabytes of RAM. Linux Mint is a little bit lighter on system resources in my experience. I've been perfectly happy when I've used Linux Mint in the past with 4 gigabytes of RAM, but I would not recommend anything below 4 gigabytes of RAM for Linux Mint, alright? Also, I would recommend an absolute minimum of a dual-core processor for both operating systems. Heck, if you're buying a new computer in 2017, I wouldn't even go below quad-core personally. Dual-core is really on its way out. For some reason, dual-core is still really popular in like Ultrabooks and stuff like that. Like considering how like phones nowadays can have quad-core processors, I know they're a different processor class than computers, but I really don't think you should get anything below a quad-core processor anymore. So yeah, also someone asked why the heck I run Windows 10 in a virtual machine when I'm running Windows 10 on the computer I'm recording it on, and it's because it's easier to record this video this way to have both operating systems running side by side right next to each other. So let's go ahead and turn on both operating systems and wait for them to boot up. In theory, Linux Mint, since it is lighter in system resources than Windows, it should boot up quicker, but they both took about the same amount of time to boot up, as you guys can see. So let's go ahead and log into both operating systems, type in my super secret passcode, or excuse me, type in my super secret password, and let's take a look at the desktop of both operating systems. So probably more often than not, especially if you're watching my channel, you guys are probably already familiar with the Windows 10 desktop and how Windows 10 works. But probably less of you, even though it probably still is a good chunk of you guys, are familiar with the Linux Mint desktop. So as you guys can see on the surface, if you're on a phone, I'm sorry, this probably looks really small. But on the surface, the Linux Mint desktop looks really similar to the Windows 10 desktop. They even both have like a taskbar at the bottom. The taskbar for the Linux Mint desktop is more like the old school Windows XP, Windows Vista, Windows 98 style taskbar, they don't automatically group windows together if you're to open like multiple windows. But nevertheless, it still looks really extremely similar to the Windows taskbar. And like in Windows, if you right click on the desktop, you can get to some of the exact same commands that you can get to in Windows. You can create a new folder, create a new document. Like in Windows, you can change your desktop background. Like a Windows, you can change some of the settings, like you can change desktop settings, like what icons show on the desktop. Windows 10, I would say it's a little tiny bit less clear how to do this, but you can also change like what icons show on the desktop. Before, I want to say Windows 7 maybe, don't quote me on this, they used to show like my computer on the desktop and my documents and whatever, but nowadays they only show the recycle bin. Linux Mint by default shows a link to your computer and icon to your home folder. Also, both operating systems have start menus. Now in Linux, it's obviously not called the start menu in Linux Mint. In Windows, it is called the start menu. I don't actually see it being referred to as the start menu anywhere on here, but nevertheless, it is the start menu. And they both operate really similar. They both immediately open to where you can access all the applications on your computer. And they both come with a lot of similar applications. They both come with a built-in web browser. Windows 10 is obviously Microsoft Edge and Internet Explorer. Linux Mint, on the other hand, uses Firefox as its default web browser, which, here we go, the Firefox web browser. They both come with image editing tools like Windows 10 comes with Microsoft Paint, and nowadays also comes with Paint 3D. Linux Mint comes with GIMP. Both come with picture viewing applications. They both come with video applications. Windows 10, it's Windows Media Player and movies and TV. Linux Mint, it comes with VLC. They both come with Office applications. Now, one thing I do like about Linux Mint is it actually includes a full Office suite where Windows does not by default. All Windows includes, as far as default Office applications goes, if I can find it, is WordPad. Well, you see all the stuff that Linux Mint includes. It includes LibreOffice, which typically, as far as my experience goes, isn't as full-featured as Microsoft Office, but at least they include something. Like, here's what LibreOffice Writer looks like. As you can see, it has all sorts of features. WordPad doesn't, to say the very least. In fact, I don't even remember the last time they actually added any new features into WordPad. It might have been in Windows 7. One of these days they updated WordPad. It might have been in Windows 7 that allow you to save as a docx file, which I don't even see. Maybe not. But I know for a fact you can at least open docx files in WordPad. Well, Linux Mint allows you to save. Since I'm talking about file formats, they allow you to save in all of this, including a docx file. So in Microsoft, if you want a full-fledged Office suite in Microsoft Windows, you have to go to the Get Office app, and it obviously costs money, although you can still download LibreOffice for Windows. Going back to the start menu in both operating systems, they both include like administrative tools and whatnot. Microsoft Windows includes a lot of administrative tools by default, like computer management, local security policy, blah, 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 blah. It also includes games. Linux Mint is really similar. Now, something I do like about Linux Mint that still isn't perfect in Windows, if you want to uninstall something, like let's say I want to install HexChat, I just right-click on it, click uninstall, enter in my password, and it'll immediately uninstall. Now, Windows, if you're using classic desktop programs, also known as Win32 apps, which is probably most people are still using Win32 apps over universal Windows platform apps or Windows Store apps. If you want to install, if you want to uninstall a Win32 app, usually what you can do is, I can't really give you guys a good example because I don't really have any third-party Win32 apps installed on here, but if you want to uninstall, let's say Windows Media Player, and I click uninstall, it brings you to the programs and features list and control panel where I have to uninstall it from there. It's not as straightforward like in Linux Mint, where I can just click uninstall and bam, it's uninstalled. Now for the Windows Store apps, you can do that. Like let's say I want to get rid of Candy Crush Soda Saga because I don't care for that game. You can right click, click uninstall, and bam, it's not there anymore. So what if I want to get third-party apps for both Windows and Linux Mint? Well, I will first of all like to mention that Windows certainly has a heck of a lot more applications and programs and whatever than Linux Mint does, but it doesn't mean Linux Mint doesn't have any. Linux Mint's application support is growing pretty much every single day, and a lot of stuff that you can get for Windows you can now get in Linux Mint. It's starting to become pretty hard pressed unless you are trying to run like a niche application not to find anything for Linux Mint. And probably the best part about applications on Linux Mint is that most of them are free, okay? So if you want to get third-party apps for Linux Mint by default, this is how they want you to do it. You just go, Linux Mint basically has a default like app store. I forget what it's called. It's called, here we go, Software Manager. You just go to the Software Manager, and then once you're in the Software Manager, you just type in whatever the heck you want, or you can just go and browse through these categories, and you're basically able to get a lot of stuff entirely free for Linux. Like let's say I want to install Inkscape, for example. Vector-based drawing program, I just click install. It will automatically download, and once it's done downloading, bam, it's on my system. Now, Windows is a little bit different. The way you do it in Windows, this was the standard pretty much up until Windows 8, and even in Windows 8 and Windows 10, it's still the standard. If you want to install a third-party application for Windows, you have to go to a website and download a random exe file, and then you have to install it, and I'm sure all of you guys know how to do this, but I'm just doing it anyways for the sake of this video. You install it, and then you have third-party applications on your computers. Now, there are a lot of people who do not like the Windows Store. So the Windows Store was introduced in Windows 8 and Windows 10, and a lot of people don't like the idea of the Windows Store because they claimed it's more locked down than going to some random website and, you know, installing a program that way. But I like the idea of the Windows Store because the Windows Store, it functions similar to the Software Manager on Linux Mint, okay? So if you go to the store in Windows, first things I want to point out is that it's not entirely universal Windows platform apps there. They have, I don't really see any here, but they do have some Win32 apps on the Windows Store. And my favorite thing about the Windows Store is that for the most part, of course there are exceptions, and same thing with Software Manager, is that there's pretty much almost no chance of downloading malware, okay? Pretty much most of everything you download from the Windows Store or Software Manager will be free of malware. The problem I have with going to third-party websites to download something, which by the way, you can do this in Linux Mint too, it's just not as common, is that there's always a chance that you can download malware to your computer. Now through the Windows Store and Software Manager, you're pretty much guaranteed to install safe apps. Like, let's say for example, I wanted to install, just for the heck of it, let's go ahead and install Adobe Photoshop Express, okay? It will just download, automatically install, and it's simple. And the other thing I like about, you know, doing stuff through, let's say, a store interface versus the traditional go to a website, download an app kind of way to do things, is that these programs will automatically update. In Linux Mint, it's a little tiny bit less automatic, but in, I'd say, a good chunk of other Linux distributions, it is automatic. And Linux Mint, though, what you usually have to do, now because it's Linux, there's ways around this, but in Linux Mint, what you are supposed to do at least, I'm opening Software Manager again, aren't I? What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to go to the Update Manager, and you can basically update everything relating to both applications and software updates here. If Windows, it's a little less simple. If you get all your apps through the Windows Store, it will just auto update. Everything will be smooth. If you want system updates in Windows, Windows, it will be all automatic, especially if you're using Windows 10. In Windows 10, there's pretty much no way to avoid updates, which is kind of unfortunate if you're like me and you like to have total control over your computer. But for the mass public, for the general consumer, this is a fantastic idea because updates for your operating system do more good than harm. They usually fix major security holes or give you new features. And there's basically no reason not to install updates unless it will absolutely break something. So for, I'd say 95% of people, it's a good idea to always install updates, and Windows 10 will do that automatically. Linux Mint, though, if you're like me and you like choice when to do stuff, Linux Mint will basically let you choose when to install your updates. Like, if there's any updates, I just clicked refresh. There's no updates right now. They would show up here, but there's no updates. Honestly, it can be good or bad, whichever way you look at it. If you're someone who likes everything to be automatic, I will be the first to admit, although Linux Mint is easy, Linux Mint probably isn't for you because on the surface, it's a little tiny bit less automatic functioning than Windows. And on the surface, if you don't want to, mess around with the command line or anything like that, or you don't want to read into how Linux Mint works or whatever, it might seem like Linux Mint is actually less customizable than Windows and how you do things or, how you can get it to look. But, Linux is Linux. Linux is open source. You can pretty much customize Linux Mint, assuming you have the know-how to do whatever you want. Microsoft Windows, you can customize to do a lot of things, but it's closed-sourced. It's proprietary code. You can't do every single thing on Windows, okay? So let's go ahead and look at more parts of the operating system. Let's look at the file managers for both operating systems. Windows 10's file manager is just called File Explorer. And here's something I don't like about File Explorer. I feel like back in like the Windows 95 and Windows 98 days, File Explorer was a heck of a lot simpler. There wasn't a quick access thing. There wasn't libraries. It just straight up showed you where your folders were, where your files were. And starting with Windows XP, they started tacking so many features into File Explorer that for the most part, in my opinion, File Explorer is an overblown mess. If you were to try and explain file management to someone who never really used Windows or a computer, Windows 10's File Explorer is a mess. You got your quick access link, which is like your favorites link, except, if you want to see where the heck this folder is actually located on your computer, right here, if you select it, for example, in the address bar, it just says desktop. That helps pretty much no one. If you want to find out where it actually is, you gotta go into the desktop properties and go here. And that is something I don't like about the Windows File Explorer. I've never liked it. I feel like since Windows XP, although the File Explorer in Windows 10, in my opinion, is easier to get around and is more functional than Windows XP's, they've just tacked so many features into there that, it's confusing to new users and even long-time users on how to use File Explorer. Now, the Linux Mint File Explorer, this is actually the Nemo File Explorer, but once again, since it's Linux, you can pretty much change it to whatever the heck you want. I like the Linux Mint File Explorer because, for the most part, it's simpler, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, to the Windows File Explorer. It straight up shows you where your files are. None of this quick access library BS that Windows 10 has. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the default web browsers of both operating systems. Windows 10 comes with the new and improved Microsoft Edge. And I'm going to be honest, I always see a lot of people on the internet, go poo-poo or whatever towards Microsoft Edge and claim it's not a good browser. And I disagree because Microsoft Edge, the thing you got to keep in mind is that it's not Internet Explorer. It has pretty much almost none of the problems that Internet Explorer was famous for. It's not slow. It's a really fast web browser. It abides to web standards, unlike Internet Explorer did. It's not bloated. It doesn't allow for, pretty much almost any plugin besides Flash, which makes it more secure. It doesn't even allow Microsoft's own technologies like ActiveX or Silverlight to run in this web browser. Basically, Edge is a good browser. I would actually consider using it as my main browser. If they released a Microsoft Edge for like Android or iOS or macOS, so I could sync all my bookmarks easily. That's pretty much the one thing that's keeping me from switching to Edge from Chrome. I'm not being like a Microsoft fanboy here. I have quite clearly stated in the past, things I've disliked about Microsoft. But I really do like the Edge web browser. It's fast, it's stable, it's secure, and it's overall very good web browser by Microsoft. Now, Windows 10 does include Internet Explorer for compatibility purposes. Microsoft, I don't think, recommends you using Internet Explorer for obvious reasons. This build of the web browser, well, this web browser, the underlying technology, first of all, it's almost 4 years old, so it's obviously not the most secure web browser, not the most abiding to web standards. It's not going to get, at least as far as I know of, any layout engine updates or whatever. Basically, I don't recommend using Internet Explorer if you're using Windows 10. And Microsoft doesn't want you to either because they have this big button here that says Open Microsoft Edge. It immediately opens a web browser. If you want to actually use Internet Explorer, it's not full front and center like in the Start menu. You have to go under Windows Accessories, and Internet Explorer is right here. And in Windows 10, you can actually turn Internet Explorer off. So yeah, basically don't use Internet Explorer unless you have to in Windows 10. Now the default web browser in Linux Mint, since Linux Mint is an open source operating system, they're going to use an open source web browser. It comes with Mozilla Firefox. Now, I love Firefox. I don't use it as my main browser of choice day to day. I use Chrome personally as my web browser, not because Chrome is the fastest or most secure, because honestly, I don't think Chrome is the fastest or most secure web browser. I think Edge can easily outperform it in speed and security. Firefox can probably easily outperform it security-wise, but Chrome is still good. I mainly use Chrome because I like how Chrome does a really good job at syncing my web history and my bookmarks from one platform to another. And I am heavily invested in Google's online services, and it's just overall an easier experience using the Google Chrome web browser as far as, my investment in Google's online services, I guess, than it is if I were to use Edge or Firefox. Linux Mint comes with Firefox, and I like Firefox. Firefox is extremely customizable. You can pretty much do whatever you want with it. Something I like about Firefox is they do emphasize privacy in the web browser. And I feel like in technology, privacy is slowly going away, or at least being minimized in modern technology. Windows 10, for example, pretty much is infamous among the tech community for its vast array of privacy issues. Windows 10 is supposedly spying on every move you do. And even if you turn your privacy settings, like if I go to privacy here, and then, I don't know if it's actually here, to be honest, but basically, let's type this into here, diagnostic privacy settings. Basically, in Windows 10, you can either choose to send basic diagnostic information to Microsoft or full diagnostic information to Microsoft. By default, you cannot turn it off without editing registry settings, which Microsoft just resets in the next Windows 10 updates. Anyways, basically, Windows 10 is a very not privacy-conscious operating system, even though they give you an entire privacy settings windows here where you can turn a lot of stuff off. But by default, you can't obviously, there's no obvious way to turn off telemetry in Windows 10. And honestly, that is one of my least favorite things about Windows 10. I do not believe telemetry is a bad thing because I do believe Microsoft when they say they use telemetry to make their operating system better, to make their apps better. I believe telemetry is very good-natured for the most part, even though at the same time with telemetry enabled Microsoft and probably the US government and other world governments can technically spy on pretty much everything you're doing on your computers. But I do not like how Microsoft and Windows 10 does not give you an option to turn off every single bit of telemetry in the operating system. Now, Linux Mint, I'm a little less clear on what telemetry is like in there, but in me exploring the operating system, basically, as far as I can tell, Linux Mint does not basically collect any telemetry, and that is something I like about Linux Mint, and their only privacy setting here is whether the computer remembers recently accessed files or not, and as you can see by default, unlike, let's say, in a Microsoft operating system, it is set to no. And this all relates back to Firefox because Mozilla, for the most part, they emphasize that privacy protection, even in your electronic life, is still important. Now, someone else may ask, well, if you're not doing anything illegal, I mean, what do you have to lose, right? It's just a whole principle of things. It's like, for example, you don't want other people to know what password you're using for, let's say, your bank account, right? That's why a lot of people do not like how modern operating systems and applications are basically becoming less and less privacy friendly because it comes to the point where if, let's say, Microsoft records down your bank account password and someone hacks into Microsoft servers, people will be able to know your bank account information, and honestly, that's not cool. All right, so all that stuff you said is great, Casey, but what else can the operating systems do? Well, they can pretty much do everything you want an operating system to do. Now, one thing that Windows 10 does include is it includes a built-in voice assistant called Cortana. Linux Mint doesn't include that. I'm not too sure whether you can get a voice assistant for Linux Mint, but Windows 10 does include Cortana, although Cortana is very privacy unfriendly. I do like Cortana. I like how, for example, I can just ask Cortana to lock my PC, and my PC will automatically lock for me. I think that's a really neat feature. And I like being able to ask Cortana questions, like what's 2 plus 2 or what's 3 plus 597. I do like the idea of Cortana. Now, what I don't like about Cortana is she can only search Bing, and she, by default, can only open stuff in the Microsoft Edge web browser. Now, Linux Mint might not include a built-in voice assistant, but Linux Mint overall, because it's Linux, is just overall more customizable, and I'd say less consumer unfriendly than a Windows operating system. Microsoft claims they only allow you to search Bing and open the Edge web browser from Cortana because it actually is more consumer friendly because it gives you the best experience. I disagree. I like being able to choose my search engine, choose my web browser. Something else I don't like about Windows 10, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to make this video pessimistic, is that in pretty much every Windows update, Microsoft claims they aren't going to do this anymore, but pretty much every Windows update, Microsoft wound up resetting all your default apps back to the quote-unquote Microsoft recommended default apps. Like if your web browser was Google Chrome, they'd automatically set it back to, let's say, Microsoft Edge. Microsoft claims they won't do this anymore, but they basically did just do this in the Windows 10 Creators Update, but they at least asked you before they do this. But the default, even if they ask you, is for them to do this, and I don't like that. That just screams consumer unfriendly to me. Linux Mint, on the other hand, as far as I can tell, does respect your default applications. Like Windows, the default applications in Linux Mint are extremely easy to change. If you want your web browser to be Firefox, you can make it be Firefox. Let's say I don't want Media Player to be my default music player. I can just change it to VLC. And voila, it's really easy, really simple. Now, Linux Mint, is pretty much just as easy as it is to install as Windows. Just take, let's say, a blank hard drive or, an already full hard drive. Let's say you want to use Linux Mint as your main operating system, okay? It is extremely easy to install. Pretty much just as easy as it is to install Microsoft Windows. And drivers, for the most part, will just work like they do on Windows. The only thing I'm kind of skeptical about regarding Linux Mint as far as drivers go is your graphics card driver might not work. I tried to install this back when my main rig had a GTX 970, and it didn't just work out of the box. I eventually got it to work, but that was a pain. But most drivers on Linux Mint should just work. And so the only other thing I think that might keep a majority of people away from Linux Mint compared to Windows is they're worried that, all their software that they're used to on Windows, let's say Microsoft Office, won't run on Linux Mint at all. Well, I'm here to tell you that a good chunk of your software will run on Linux Mint. Linux Mint already supports most of the most popular applications that Windows supports. It already supports Chrome, it supports Firefox, it supports Steam for gaming, it supports VLC Player. But even if Linux Mint doesn't support all this stuff, you can always download something called Wine. Let me show you guys real quickly what Wine is. I knew if I just typed in wine, it would tell me about actual wine. So let's just type in wine Linux, and I'll probably get something, a little bit more relevant. All right, so Wine HQ. So what is Wine? It stands for Wine is not an emulator, but it feels pretty similar to an emulator, if you ask me. It's a compatibility layer capable of running Windows applications. So basically all you do is you download and install Wine, and then you can run a good chunk of Windows applications once you have Wine download and installed. And you can run a lot of games that you couldn't run on here before. Now you can with Wine. Same thing with, a lot of Windows-only applications. And basically, I do recommend downloading and installing Wine if you're going to use Linux Mint as your main operating system, because most people probably aren't completely ready to give up, most of their Windows applications. But let's say Wine doesn't cut it. What else can you do? Download VirtualBox. And let me show you guys what VirtualBox is real quickly. VirtualBox is a powerful x86 and AMD 64/Intel 64 virtualization product. So what VirtualBox allows you to do is run a virtual machine like VMware does. And what does VirtualBox allow you to run? Windows 10, Windows 7, Windows 8.1, Windows XP. So basically, if you can't run whatever the heck you want to run, like let's say Microsoft Office 2016 won't work with Wine, okay? All you have to do is download VirtualBox, install Windows and VirtualBox. It's really easy to do. It's pretty much straightforward. It's just basically clicking a bunch of buttons. You just install Windows in there, and then you have Windows running on your Linux Mint computer. It's that simple. And so I guess the truly last point I want to emphasize that keeps people away from using Linux and instead keeps them using Windows or let's say Mac OS is a lot of people are under the misconception that Linux operating systems are harder to use than Windows. And that is simply not the truth. Now, if you want to do, for the most part, any real customization with Linux Mint, like if you want to mess with, kernel-wide, I guess, like kernel-wide features or, deep level system features or stuff like this, you are probably going to have to go into the terminal and, edit stuff that way. And I think what scares people off is people are under this giant misconception that pretty much everything you do in a Linux operating systems, if you want to do more than just the basics like, opening an application and doing stuff inside it, you have to use a command line interface to do it. And for the most part, you don't have to touch the command line in Linux if you don't want to. I find touching the command line useful every now and again for the stuff that I want to do, but for the most part, the average user will never have to touch the command line in Linux. Like they don't have to touch, let's say, PowerShell or, the regular command prompt in Windows. for the most part, you probably shouldn't ever have to touch the command line in Linux. But if you do ever have to touch the command line in Linux, I mean, if whatever the heck you want to do, if you just Google it, chances are someone's already figured out all the commands you need to type in the command line. The command line, it's really not that hard to use once you get used to it. You don't have to know every single command off the top of your head, and you probably won't ever have to touch the command line. But the command line, it's not scary once you have a closer idea of what you're doing in the command line, okay? But for the most part, in my personal opinion, you probably wouldn't ever have to touch the command line in Linux Mint, just like the same way how the majority of people that do touch the command line in Windows, all they do is they fire it up to run, let's say, ipconfig, and it'll tell you your IP address and, stuff like that. For the most part, I just don't think Linux Mint is necessarily any harder to use in Windows. There's a reason that they recommend, like a lot of people who use Linux, they recommend that, if you want to switch away from using Microsoft Windows, to start off with Linux Mint. It is easy to use, it is fast, it is stable, and it's overall just a good operating system to use. Now, the reason I don't personally, well, I do use Linux Mint all the time, but the reason I don't use Linux Mint over Windows personally myself as my main operating system of choice is basically I like having Windows installed because I don't like having to use Wine to run stuff. I want to run Windows applications completely natively on my computer, and Windows just simply has more applications than any other platform. Last time I checked, this was actually back in 2014, but in 2014 there was over 4 million programs available for Windows, which I think is still more than any other operating system. I know like Android and iOS are catching up. As far as desktop operating systems goes, Windows can pretty much run any Windows program dating back to the 1990s. It's just simple that way. And personally, I don't really have many problems with Windows 10, even though I spent like a good 4 or 5 minutes complaining about Windows 10 privacy issues and some of the anti-consumer moves that Microsoft is doing. But if you're ever looking to get away from Windows, like let's say you're on Windows 7 or Windows 8 and you don't want to update to Windows 10 because you don't like the way Microsoft handles Windows 10 or like the features in Windows 10, give Linux Mint a go, okay? Linux Mint is really easy to use. Like I've said before in this video, it's easy to use, it's stable. Since it's not Windows, you will not get malware as easily. It does, have security holes every now and again, but like Windows, those can be patched through updates. And pretty much everything administrative you want to do on Linux Mint, it either requires a password or for you to run as root, the root account, which is basically like the built-in administrator account in Windows as a quick and dirty comparison. Linux Mint, I would seriously consider giving it a go, especially if you've never used Linux. Heck, even if you don't want to switch away from Windows to Linux, just download VirtualBox and give Linux Mint a go. Install Linux Mint in VirtualBox. Chances are you will probably really like Linux Mint and you'll be really happy with it. You might even like it better than Windows. So yeah, that was my comparison between Windows and Linux Mint. I know there's probably a lot of points I didn't cover, but that's just quick and dirty, even though it wasn't that quick, comparison of Windows versus Linux Mint. So let's go ahead and shut down both operating systems, okay? Let's go ahead and shut it down. They'll both probably take around the same amount of time to shut down. I thought Windows would have actually shut down a little faster than it did, but once again, that was my comparison of Windows 10 versus Linux Mint. I hope you guys liked this video. Be sure to like this video if you want to see more operating systems comparisons videos. Leave a comment down below. Thank you guys for watching so much. Be sure to check out my social media links down below in the video description. I really do have fun interacting with all you guys on there. It is so cool to actually interact and talk with my subscribers. Seriously, I love all you guys for supporting my channel, subscribing to my channel. I really do have fun on YouTube. I really do. Heck, even if YouTube stopped paying me any ad revenue, I would still probably make videos for YouTubes, or I still appreciate you guys for sticking with my channel, for watching my channel. And I probably will do more operating systems comparisons videos in the future, since it seems like you guys like these kind of videos the best. So yeah, I thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys next time. Goodbye.